In this section, we're going to talk about matter and elements and other chemical aspects of living things. Matter is anything that takes up space and has mass and is made of elements. So matter is basically everything. Rocks, gases, my favorite things on the planet, which are kittens, you and me, the shoes that you're wearing, etc. Everything is made of matter. And elements cannot be broken down into other substances. Carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen are examples of elements, and each element has its own unique atoms. Now, an atom is the smallest unit of matter with an element's properties. These are tiny, tiny, like beyond microscopic small. Each element has unique atoms, and they're composed of three types of subatomic particles, which are little pieces that are common to all atoms, and you put them together in certain ratios, and that makes atoms of carbon different from atoms of nitrogen. So neutrons are neutrally charged, protons are positively charged, and electrons are negatively charged. Here's a great picture of an atom. You've got negatively charged electrons here. We've got, in the blue, are the positively charged protons, and in the red are the neutrally charged neutrons. Now, there are several different ways of putting atoms together to make something bigger than just one atom. A compound, for instance, is two or more different elements combined in a fixed ratio. So table salt is an example, and you can see this here, sodium and chlorine together. A molecule is two or more of the same or different elements combined in a fixed ratio. So oxygen gas is a great example of a molecule. It's just two oxygen atoms floating around together in the atmosphere. So a molecule can be the same or different atoms, but a compound is two or more different atoms. So every compound is a molecule, but not every molecule is a compound. So let's look at the electrons here. Electrons are found orbiting in what we call shells around the nucleus of the atom. So here's an example of one shell. The valence shell is the outermost shell, and we call the electrons in this shell the valence electrons. That makes it easy, right? Only the valence electrons can interact with other atoms, and that's because the other shells are interior to that, closer to the nucleus, and it's sort of like a baseball within a baseball. These electrons can't interact with anything around this atom because they can't get to it, because these are in the way. Atoms are most reactive if the valence shell is incomplete. So that means that an atom that wants more electrons is much more likely to interact with another atom. And that brings us to chemical bonds. These are attractions that keep atoms close together. And protons and electrons attract each other like magnets, and so that is what's actually keeping the atoms close together. Let's look at two different types of chemical bonds. The first one is covalent, and the CO here tells you that there's sharing going on, like they're cooperating together. And covalent bonds are a sharing of a pair of electrons, and these are considered strong bonds. So here's an example of electrons being shared between carbon and hydrogen in the molecule methane. The white electrons here are from hydrogen, and the black ones are from carbon. And so in each of these groups that I've got circled, carbon is sharing hydrogen's electron, and hydrogen is sharing carbon's electron, so they both end up being happy because they fill their valence shells. Now, there are two different types of covalent bonds. One is called a nonpolar bond, and this is an example of a nonpolar bond because the sharing of the electrons is equal. Now, there are polar covalent bonds, which make all kinds of interesting things happen. And a good example of polar covalent bonds happen with oxygen and hydrogen, which form water when you put two of those oxygens together. Oxygen wants electrons very, very badly. And so what happens with this sharing is that the electrons spend a little bit more time around the oxygen and give it what this here is a partial negative charge. This is a little symbol in Latin. And so they spend a little less time around the hydrogens, which gives this part of the atom a slightly positive charge. And so we call these slight charges poles. You'll see later when we talk about water what that does with atom interactions. So ionic bonds are interesting because one atom actually steals an electron from the other because it wants it so much more than the other one does. So the atom that steals the electron we call the anion, and the atom that loses the electron we call the cation. These are also considered strong bonds. And so once one atom has lost its electron and the other atom has gained an electron, they're then attracted to each other just like the magnets we looked at before. And so that's where that bond comes from. Now, hydrogen bonds are interesting because they're weak bonds, but at the same time, they contribute to some of the most interesting phenomena on our planet. So the hydrogen bonds are between the partial negative poles of the oxygen on a water molecule and the partial positive pole of the hydrogen in another water molecule. So over here, we've got a partial positive here and a partial negative here. And so they're attracted to each other, just like a magnet. It's a weak attraction because the poles are not the same as the atoms being turned into ions. It's just like barely an electric charge, barely negative over here, and barely positive over here, and that creates this weak bond that we call the hydrogen bond. And we'll talk more about that with water. So let's talk about chemical reactions. Chemical reactions make and break chemical bonds. And so a reaction is when reactants are reacting together. That makes it easy to remember. And this is the start of the reaction. So if we're talking about this reaction here, proceeding in this direction, the atoms that we start with are NH3 and H2O. So these are the reactants. The products are produced, so they are the end result of the reaction. We'll call these the products over here. And so you end up with NH4 plus, which is a cation, and OH minus, which is an anion. So the basic formula for a reaction is A plus B gives you C. And you'll see that this arrow goes in both directions because in a lot of cases the reaction can go in both directions. So it can go A plus B gives you C, or C is taken apart into A and B. So finally, let's talk a little bit about energy. Energy is a really interesting topic, and so it brings up some laws that are actually part of the physical sciences, and I know this is biology, but all of it is related, and hopefully you'll see that through the rest of the course. The first law of thermodynamics says that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can be transformed or transferred, but you can never get rid of it or create it out of nowhere. The second law of thermodynamics says that reactions tend to increase disorder, and that means making energy less available for cells. An endothermic reaction takes energy from the environment, and an exothermic reaction releases energy. And this explosion here is a great picture of an explosion. This is an example of an exothermic reaction releasing quite a lot of energy. All bombs are examples of exothermic reactions.